Thank you everyone for joining us. As everyone starts tuning in, I'm going to go over some housekeeping items. And I want to remind you that the recording for this talk will be taking place. And if you can, we have the chat feature open. We'd like to see where everyone is tuning in from. And while I go over the housekeeping items, if this is the first time you're joining the RIC Talks, the international community of the Society of Professional Journalists, we're a community of journalists that encourage press freedom globally. Our aim with our IC Talk series is to connect journalists at a time when it's really difficult to do so in person. So with these one-on-one conversations, we're really aiming to dig a little deeper and create an opportunity for you guys, the guests, to have direct access to our speaker. We hope you learn, grow, and take away from today information that will be helpful and inspire you in your work going forward. The format's really simple. The guests and I will all have a conversation. We have the chat and Q&A feature open. The Q&A feature will be for you, the attendees, to ask our guest questions. Once you have a question, we will unmute you and you can ask them directly. If you prefer that I ask the question for you, please make sure to note that and I'll be more than happy to do so. Just a reminder, since we have many attendees for today, to please make sure to keep your questions brief. That way we can get through all of them. And please make sure that in the chat portion, you leave any technical questions or concerns. My co-chair, Dan Kubisky, he's gonna keep an eye on that for us. Our guest today is Sanford J. Ungar, the current director of the nonpartisan Free Speech Project at Georgetown University, which documents the status of free expression in education, government, and civil society in America. Ungar was director of the Voice of America for 2 years during the Clinton administration, and previously was dean of the School of Communications at American University. During his journalism career, he was a staff writer for the Washington Post, Washington editor of The Atlantic, managing editor of Foreign Policy magazine, and co-host of All Things Considered on NPR. He is the author of 6 nonfiction books, including The Papers, an account of legal and political battle over the Pentagon Papers. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Ungar.
Pleased to be with you, Elle.
You know, we've had a lot of questions coming in about Voice of America, and I know we're really going to go in depth with that in a moment. But I first wanted to take a step back and go to a moment when you first started your career in journalism. And, you know, you've built an admirable career, and I'm curious to see what inspired you to get into journalism in the first place.
Oh, well, there are various ways that I could answer that question. I think the start of it was that my sister, who is 12 years older than I, was editor of our high school newspaper in a small town in Pennsylvania. It was a pretty lousy newspaper, I must say. And I wanted to follow in her footsteps as editor of the high school newspaper. So that was my first sort of journalism role. And then in college, I had the opportunity to be on the staff of one of America's great student newspapers. We put out a 6-day-a-week daily morning hard copy newspaper. And it was like a full-time job along with going to school. And I am part of the sort of maybe 25-30% of people who worked for that newspaper who became so convinced that it was a good thing to do that we actually became journalists. Maybe it's more than 30%. Maybe it's close to half. But many of them went on to be lawyers and businessmen, but some of us stuck with journalism after doing that.
Amazing.
My first real full-time job with journalism was a wire service job in Paris for UPI in the late 1960s. And that was a very thrilling moment to be practicing journalism in a place where the world was falling apart at that moment.
What was it like being an American in Paris as a journalist?
Well, it was great to be an American in Paris, but the moment was, you may remember 1968 was such a volatile time in so many places. And in France, there was a worker-student revolt, which ultimately led to the downfall of Charles de Gaulle, president of France. So in the spring of 1968, there was just nightly well, often the daytime as well, but mostly at night, chaos in the streets, demonstrations against the government, against the establishment, against life as everyone knew it, and really trying to overturn the order. I'd never lived through anything like that before, and probably not since either. Uh, de Gaulle ultimately figured out some ways to quiet things down, but about 9 months later, he resigned from office, and as a direct result of all this. So it was a great moment. Up all night in the streets, filing stories, uh, constant emergency on our hands for about 3-4 months.
Do you see the differences in the journalism field from then to now? And what are those differences that you're seeing?
Oh, well, I think at the time, journalists were not celebrities particularly. I always thought of it, especially working for a wire service, and perhaps especially in Europe at that time, I sort of thought of it as a blue collar occupation in many ways. And it was, what we were doing at that moment, and later in Africa where I worked, and many other places, there were some glamorous things that happened, but you really had to be willing to get your hands dirty. You didn't get a lot of invitations to be on television talk shows or anything like that. Describe what you were doing. You had to be committed to getting the news out. I think today, obviously, there are a lot of people who do go into journalism to try to achieve celebrity status, to try to be part of the action. And I understand how that's evolved. I'd just as soon hear from journalists much of the time as from anybody else who has a harder time sorting out facts from opinions. But it's a very, very different world now from when I first started in journalism. In fact, at one point, uh, when I was at the Washington Post for 4 years, when I first came to Washington, I was invited by NPR, for whom I would later work, to offer commentary on some coverage of the Watergate hearings, and the Post said I couldn't do it because had to stick to my beat, stick to my job. I had some information that would have been useful, but so that's just how different it was. Today, anybody covering stories at the heart of the news probably doesn't even ask his or her editor anymore whether it's okay to go be on television or on the radio. But in those days, we were pretty carefully controlled, I would say. If you were hired by the Washington Post wanted 100% of your effort.
Right. Do you find that to be something that's an obstacle now, or that's something that's a benefit for journalists being able to, or having that energy or that mentality to go forward in that direction?
Well, of course, as most of us know, there's been this pendulum of how journalism and journalists are viewed in this country over a long period of time. In the Watergate period, uh, journalists were seen as having saved the day, having saved American democracy, having exposed Richard Nixon and some of the other people involved in Watergate. And then, of course, over time, I mean, before that, opponents of the Vietnam War, they were pariahs and thought to be unpatriotic. Uh, and there have been some declines in the reputation of journalism since. I mean, today, Donald Trump says journalists are the enemy of the people, enemies of the people. And I think this has been another period when the prestige and the appreciation for journalists has been on the rise again, because many stories are being broken about the government, if you will, that we just wouldn't know about if it weren't for crusading journalists and people doing their job. So I think this is a time when I think journalists have had an opportunity to play their historic and I would argue constitutional role in a very important way. I do think one very positive development, especially in the mainstream media, is the notion of several people working collaboratively on a big story. You see bylines now in the Washington Post, the New York Times, other places too, of 3, 4, 5 people sometimes on a story. And going back to when I was at the Post, the newsroom was so harshly competitive. That was pretty rare to have any more than 2 people sharing a byline at that time. And I think the collaborative efforts within newsrooms and journalism situations today, that collaboration has helped to sharpen and improve the journalism, I believe.
And eventually your career led you to serving as director of Voice of America during the Clinton administration. I'm really looking forward to getting your insight on all the dynamic events that have been taking place this year at VOA. We've, had the change with Michael Pack being appointed, from him cleaning house, they're calling it, of the heads of the different agencies, and then just having him in place. What do you think that appointment of Michael Pack and his history with Stephen Bannon is for the future of Voice of America?
Well, I think a lot of people were waiting to see what Donald Trump would do with Voice of America and with the other American radios. And in fact, as I understand it, during the transition after he was elected, some young people went over to VOA to scout it out. I'm not sure that even to this day, the president knows or understands or cares to know or understand what VOA really is, but it was not surprising for him to begin to think of it, see it as a sort of subversive organization that he had to do something about. It came belatedly. He tried to get Michael Pack confirmed for quite a while. There were some allegations about Pack's involvement in some business deals that raised questions and delayed his actually become. To be clear, he is not the director of the Voice of America. He is the CEO of the latest in a long string of governmental configurations that supervises and rules over VOA in a certain sense.
Right.
When I was there, it was something called the Broadcasting Board of Governors, which barely exists anymore. But I think that Stephen Bannon was, for some time, a point man on this, didn't like VOA, thought, I mean, it's a temptation. This is not the first time that a president or a presidential administration has looked at VOA or discovered VOA and sort of licked his lips and said, wow, there's something. If I could control that, I could control the image, my image, or the image of my administration around the world. So I think a lot of people, I think VOA had its best director ever, Amanda Bennett, for the last several years. And I think that she and other people working with her knew that the time would come when the Trump administration would make a move. The only surprise was that it took so long in its what may well prove to be its last year. It did this. So Michael Pack, I don't know him personally. He has been a documentary film producer with a conservative bent. Nothing wrong with that. But I think he is believed by many of the people at VOA to have come in with a kind of mandate from the White House, from Donald Trump, to clean house, to try to move the VOA's emphasis and its tone to be very supportive of the administration. Now, you know, during the Iraq War, during the George W. Bush administration, there was a big attempt to get VOA to push for international opinion to be in favor of the American effort in Iraq. I think not as, not, even though it was pretty blatant, it was probably not as blatant as some of the things that Trump would like VOA to be forced to do. And the other radios, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, Radio Free Asia, the Arab Broadcasting Network, Cuba Broadcasting Network, the sort of collection of journalistic agencies, radio and television, internet. So it's going to be very interesting to see. It's, of course, very late in the game for Trump to be trying to assert this authority over VOA. And it's hard to know whether it'll have much impact that quickly. Of course, PAC did relieve the heads of Amanda Bennett and her top people resigned shortly before Michael PAC came into office, but they knew what was coming. He would have fired her too, and he fired the heads of the other radios. So he took, I think, dramatic action. But it, you know, it's hard to turn an aircraft carrier around, and so I'm not sure he'll have as much success influencing the Voice of America as he'd like to.
Overall, have you ever seen in any previous administration something like this, or an administration being so involved with the agency as we're seeing under the Trump administration? Can you give us a little bit context with the history of the VOA as to?
Well, to be honest, you know, there've been so many. There's been a history of such short service for some directors of the Voice of America. It was used as a place to put presidential allies by many administrations. I can't remember right now the name of the first of Ronald Reagan's directors of the Voice of America, but I remember being told he was an advertising man from New York. He worked only at night, and he spent 7 months there and then left because it was a different job from what he expected. So there have been a number of times when there has seemed to be a threat of someone taking VOA over and twisting it that didn't really get very far. Actually, in recent years, by recent I mean the last 25 years, 30 years, there have been more journalists who've been director of the VOA than in some prior times. It was controlled as a presidential, strictly a presidential appointment for many years. Now I'm talking about VOA itself, not the U.S. Agency for Government Media, which is what Michael PAC is the head of. But you know, there have been some quite distinguished journalists now in recent times. I like to think of myself as having run VOA. I don't know about the distinguished part, but certainly as a journalist would do. I was not aware of any propaganda efforts while I was there. We resisted any efforts by the State Department to tell us what to do or what to say. Of course, we were broadcasting, when I was at VOA, as I recall, it was 51 languages. And, you know, if I were to tell you under oath that I knew exactly what was being said in all 51 languages, I would be vulnerable to being charged with perjury, because it was very hard to be certain when things were translated into all these different languages. We had program reviews, we had, you know, scripts were checked from time to time, but it is possible that some things happened, as did just recently, actually, that some things happened that people didn't initially know about. But I think that I feel pretty proud of my, I think it was 2 years and 1 week that I was at VOA from 1999 to 2001, that we maintained a strict journalistic principle. You know, there was a charter passed for VOA during the Ford administration in the 1970s that required a kind of balanced view, reporting the news in the best traditions of American journalism. It also required a kind of depiction of average American life, which is a good thing, and not a not bad to be asked to have a style section in effect at VOA, and also there grew up to be editorials, which I was not a great fan of, that expressed the official opinion of the U.S. government in all those different languages. But I think we maintained a pretty good journalistic shop. I hired distinguished journalists to work at VOA in various roles, and felt good about that. And there have been at least some of the people in the meantime. I left VOA in 2001, 19 years ago, but there have been some people since then who were not journalists, but the majority of the years there were journalists in charge.
So during your time as the director, what do you think is important for the public to understand about that position that they probably don't understand or probably don't know about, that you think is important to understand?
Well, I think that VOA has had very few advocates within the United States, very few. I always used to say when I was there that I couldn't think of any politicians who were elected or defeated on the basis of where they stood on Voice of America, ever. People just didn't pay that much attention. When VOA was created during World War II, initially to answer German propaganda, so it was a kind of propaganda agency initially during World War II, and its first language was German, of course, and then later other Axis languages during World War II. But when VOA was moved into the U.S. Information Agency, actually I think when the U.S. Information Agency was created in the late 1940s or early 50s, it was really intended to be insulated from pressures. And VOA had some people worked there, actually, sort of bizarre thing, but they were foreign service officers initially. And they had foreign service credentials, but they had this autonomy to report. And especially in certain parts of the world, I worked in Africa, we lived and worked in Africa for a while. And among the foreign correspondents in Africa, everybody looked up to the VOA correspondents. They were among the most professional of the journalists working in most African capitals. There were some places where there was only VOA, BBC, and a couple other broadcasters, where very few, some wire services, sometimes some newspapers, but not many news organizations maintained bureaus, even in the heyday of foreign correspondence. So the VOA correspondents were pretty remarkable people. I remember when I spent 6 months working in Nairobi, partly freelance and then eventually for Newsweek, I really looked up to the VOA correspondent there as somebody who knew more about the stories than most of the other people who were there. So VOA was, and to a very substantial degree still is, a strong professional journalistic organization. It just happens the publisher, as it were, the owner, happens to be the United States government. That is a very strange status, and you'll find people who say, a government journalistic organization is an oxymoron. And I see why they say that. But
Right.
in recent years, and again, recent years, I include the time I was there, so that was 20 years ago, the main role of VOA in that period was to provide information in an American style, which is to say objective, many-sided journalism in countries around the world that didn't have a local free press. And so it was a huge service to be providing this information to people who otherwise didn't have access to it, about in many cases, not just their own countries, but the entire world. So while the old stereotype of VOA, along with Radio Free Europe, was in the cold, people drawing their curtains closed and huddling in a corner, listening to shortwave radio. I never quite understood about the curtains, but listening to shortwave radio surreptitiously to hear things. And that was a role that VOA played during much of the Cold War. Really, in recent years, it's been much more providing information where there was an information desert, where there was a drought of information, and there were not many choices. And if governments didn't do this, including the UK with the BBC, France with Radio France International, the Netherlands had one of the best international broadcasting operations, the Canadians. And of course, the Russians and the Chinese used international radio very powerfully for propaganda purposes in their cases. But if these Western governments had not had these radio services, the populations of many third world countries, developing countries, would have been vulnerable to Russian and Chinese propaganda radio for their information, radio and eventually television. So when I got to VOA, I was shocked to learn that our largest audience, the countries with our largest per capita audience were Ethiopia, Bangladesh, Nigeria, places like that, not necessarily Russia or China or some of the opponents of from the Cold War time. So an attack on VOA, an effort to prevent VOA from doing its proper business, ultimately is an attack on freedom of information in many countries around the world where the service is badly needed. And that's still true today.
Right. And so there's been a lot of concern recently about the future of Voice of America, and will it turn into something like a Trump TV? What are your thoughts on what's going to be taking place going forward with everything that's happened so far this year? Are there concerns?
Well, of course, I am concerned. I was worried. You know, this is in the category of things that take a long time to improve and a short time to destroy. And VOA's credibility has built up over a long time. I mean, I can't tell you, you know, when I traveled for VOA, I wasn't going to the great Western capitals of the world. I was going to Bangladesh, to Pakistan, to Thailand, to Nigeria, to Ethiopia, to sign contracts, the Congos, to sign contracts with government officials or FM broadcasters to carry VOA programs. And I just worry, I know it's actually Amanda Bennett's travel schedule all those years later, after I was director, was very similar to mine. She went to many of those same places. Of course, occasionally there were international conferences too. But I worry about that focus being maintained and continued. VOA costs the federal government so little money. And I used to say, when I had to give my own sort of talks as director for 2 years to ensure and promote funding for VOA, we couldn't take any money from outside the government the way public radio can. I used to say the total budget for VOA for a year was about the cost of one wing of one bomber for the military. It was so little money, and I believe it's still true. I mean, the only outside funding came in for do-good projects like working with Rotary International on eradication of polio, and that's the kind of thing that VOA did when I was there, when polio was still a real menace. a kind of public service journalism, going to villages and remote places in developing countries to promote awareness of polio. It was public service journalism, and working with a, a non-profit private service club like Rotary International a, a great thing to do. And I think actually if polio was eradicated or nearly eradicated in that period, it was not just through government efforts, but largely through the efforts of the Voice of America and Rotary International. So those are all important to the role of America in the world. Seems acutely ironic now to say that, since this country has the worst coronavirus infections per capita of any place in the world. But in that time, promoting vaccination against polio was a noble cause. And I had no trouble being attached to that. I thought that was a very important service for us to provide. And, I just think it's a shame that more people in this country don't know and understand what the Voice of America is and can be. Right after, as I was starting to say, when the U.S. Information Agency was formed and VOA was made a part of it, it was illegal for VOA programs to be heard in the United States. The famous Smith-Mundt Act, I believe it was passed actually in 1948. And one of its provisions said that this government-funded radio could not be broadcast within the United States. There were a lot of reasons for that. One was a legitimate fear of propaganda, that if there was a government radio, it might, in the hands of an unscrupulous administration, might try to influence the public in its own direction. But the other, frankly, the other main reason was that the commercial broadcasters, who were just becoming very strong, didn't want a government-funded opposition or competition. That's why it took so long to get public radio started and public television in this country compared to others. It was only in the 1960s and 70s that public radio and television became strong. And so people just didn't know the programs. They didn't know about VOA. They would hear about it and just think, oh, it's a government propaganda agency. But really, I think there were very few times when that was the case in VOA's history.
Right. So how would you compare the reporters from VOA as opposed to like the private sector, for those that are comparing VOA reporters to being?
Well, when some people in Congress would discover VOA, and I mean discover, they would learn that it was there. I mean, I was astonished when I was director, and I had to go up and see the chairs and the ranking minority members of the various appropriations subcommittees in Congress that were approving our budget. Some distinguished senators and congressmen whose names I won't necessarily mention right now. Most of them are either deceased or out of office anyway, but they would ask me where the VOA was located. And it was actually about 3 blocks from the House office buildings on Capitol Hill. Many of these people could not have come to work without passing the building, but they didn't realize it was there. So sometimes when waves would start up to defund VOA or reduce the funding for VOA, they'd say, well, in our way of thinking, in our way of life, this is done by the private sector. This is done by commercial broadcasters. So there was always this feeling that CNN should be persuaded to take over what VOA was doing. Well, there were 2 problems with that. One is that CNN was not about to take government funding of that sort as a private broadcaster. And CNN, it never would have paid for CNN to do that. I mean, it, CNN's audience in Bangladesh, they were not going to worry about their advertising revenue from Bangladesh. They weren't going to put a lot of effort in. But the Voice of America could do that and could do it in Nigeria. And I'm mentioning only a few countries around the world, places in Latin America, places in Europe as well, that were still coming along. I mean, in the war in the Balkans in the 1980s and 90s, VOA and the other international broadcasters played a huge role in getting the truth out within Serbia, for example, and in Bosnia. So these are not profitable markets for broadcasters. So the private sector was never going to do this job. And I think that it's going to be harder and harder, no matter who is in office, and especially given the nature of the government deficit. If Vice President Biden is elected president, what he's going to be facing, I don't have huge feelings of optimism that although he knows Voice of America, he was chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee at the time I was director of VOA. Although he understands what it was and it is, I don't see his administration providing, if it comes into being, providing a huge infusion of cash into this public service organization and its sister radios as well.
It looks like we have a question coming in from Gary Thompson. Gary, we're going to unmute you so you can ask Sanford your question.
Yeah, hi, Sandy.
Yes.
This is Gary Thomas, one of your former employees.
Hi, Gary. How are you?
I'm fine, living down here in Florida.
I remember you when you were living in much more exotic places.
Indeed.
Bangkok,
couple of quick,
for one.
a little more comfortable than they used to be. I had two questions. I was wondering, first of all, what the effect of the advent of social media do you think that has had on VOA's news practices? And then also, in other words, I mean, has the erosion of the firewall due to social media and not purely just to the efforts of the Trump administration? And second of all, what do you think of the practice of the language services, often staffed by people who come from a tradition of not where the media is supposed to be partisan, and therefore it's harder to perhaps teach them to be more balanced? And has that been a problem at VOA?
Well, let me take that last part of your question first, Gary. Sure. I think that in some of the language services over time, and you probably know much more about this than I really do, there were people who came as refugees to the United States. For example, there were many Russian refugees who came to the U.S. As it happened, as you probably know, many of the Russian language broadcasters at VOA, when I was there, were actually medical doctors. They had immigrated to the United States. They couldn't get their American medical credentials, and they sort of recruited each other to work at VOA and to oppose communism. So there was probably a strong anti-communist bias within the Russian service. And it probably persisted after the end of the Cold War as well. But I do think that in a lot of the services where the audience started to build up, like some of these African countries, Latin American ones, et cetera, that the people working at VOA would have been journalists in their own countries if they could have had the freedom to do so. And that they understood American journalism, what we were trying to do. That's not to say that it wasn't difficult sometimes. And I think a lot of training, retraining, these program reviews were very important. Let me turn to your question about social media. You may remember it was during my brief 2-year tenure at VOA that we established the first internet desk at the VOA, and we were building up services within online services within some of the language services that had the wherewithal and the interest in doing it. We made a very, very important decision that I remember very well. When we were first developing a website and a web address, there was pressure from some circles to call it voa.gov because it had government funding. But it turned out the address voa.com was available, and with the coordinated effort of some members of the Broadcasting Board of Governors at the time and some of the people who worked closely with me. I remember somebody called Myrna Whitworth, who was the program director at the time, felt very strongly about this, as did some other people. We registered VOA as voa.com. And that was a very important statement that our social media effort as well, I'm not sure the term social media had even been invented yet at that time, but as time went on, that it would also be a journalistic effort, not a government effort. So I think that the online work of the VOA is some of the most important work it's still doing. And there's been some fantastic exposure of problems around the world. And I think the internet service of VOA in its various languages has been a great success. There's also, especially in Amanda Bennett's years, been some fantastic investigative reporting at VOA. Some of it put out in video form that was just magnificent. VOA has won many journalistic awards in recent years and over a long period for its investigative reporting and its genuine journalism.
Looks like we have another question coming in from Daniel Robinson. I'm going to go ahead and ask for him. He says, one of the attacks made against Mr. Pack was that his decision to return VOA editorials to a position of prominence at VOA, including online, would somehow reduce the amount of hard news and other news content. Yet there's no evidence that this has happened. Another attack point by major media has been that Mr. Pack would turn VOA into the voice of Trump. Yet throughout VOA's history, VOA has reflected the views of the administration in power in those editorials. Yet these remain two of the key attack points against what is, after all, a legally appointed and installed leadership of a federal agency, which is what USAGM is after all. I'd be interested to see Mr. Ungar's views on these points.
Well, of course, I also know Dan Robinson and respect him for the great work he did at VOA during my time as director. I have to disagree with him about the editorials. I don't think that they help VOA at all. I don't think the US government should use editorials on a journalistic organization to try to promote its policies. You know, there's a very interesting thing. The editorials were consistently, over many years, took a very, I hesitate to fall into the trap of using the word conservative, but I don't have another word in its place right now, a kind of nationalistic attitude. And you know what, it didn't matter. I mean, Bill Clinton was president when I was director of VOA in the beginning of George W. Bush's term. The editorials that came from the State Department or were sent to the State Department for clearance and came back were nationalist editorials under Clinton, just as they were under anybody else. I mean, I think it was just the people who were writing them at VOA and the people who were clearing them at the State Department. I don't think that had or has a proper place in that sort of news organization, especially in some of the language services where they only had 2 or 3 broadcasters And so the voice of the editorials was often the same as the voice of the news. And it was very difficult for the listeners to tell the difference. As for whether uh, Michael Pack has turned VOA into the voice of Trump, uh, he hasn't had very much time to work on doing that. He's had his hands full with other things going on, and he arrived in office. I don't know, I have no guess other than a sort of a negative one about why he fired the heads of all these other radios, and he, he, he seemed to be coming in to straighten something out. I'm not clear what it was he had to straighten out, because some of the wacko conspiracy accusations against VOA and the other government radios are just not true. There was no Chinese communist propaganda on VOA, which the president has claimed. I mean, the president, quite honestly, doesn't know what he's talking about with regard to VOA. Some people have given him some very biased talking points, and he sounds off. So I don't know. I can guess what the voice of Trump might sound like if it were to happen. In all honesty, I don't listen to VOA very often now. I follow some of its stories and some of its reporting, but I don't think that's happened yet. And frankly, I think if President Trump is reelected, I think there will be a voice of Trump. I think if he's not, that will be nipped in the bud. I hope that somebody won't think it ought to be a voice of Biden or a voice of Kamala Harris or somebody else. I hope it will continue or will return to the role of being an American-style, respectable, and honored journalistic institution.
And there was a follow-up question from Daniel, also wondering if Sandy really thinks that major media coverage of the US AGM story as it relates to PAC, which has been overwhelmingly negative, ratio has been something like 99-1 negative, and that began almost immediately after the 2016 election.
Well, I don't know if it began right after the 2016 election. I know that Michael Pack was trying to get this job for a long time. I've heard that he needed a job, and this was the one he wanted. I don't know him personally, but there were a number of questions about his financial dealings. Certain members of the Senate, Senator Menendez from New Jersey, I know, was one. Some others had some real questions, and I don't believe those questions were ever answered. I doubt initially that President Trump knew that his people were trying to push Michael Pack into that job. I think eventually he came to know. It may have been Steve Bannon who was pushing the idea, but it took a long time, I must say, compared to some other jobs where the president and his close colleagues were able to get their people into certain government jobs. It took a long time, indeed, the middle of President Trump's fourth year, for Michael Pack to be appointed. I think that people were alarmed given Pack's background and reputation, his association with Steve Bannon. They were alarmed that he wanted to turn VOA and other government media organizations into propaganda arms for the government. He talks a good line about not wanting to do so. I don't know that he's taken any dramatic moves to prove that he doesn't want to do so, but he did come in under difficult circumstances, I'm sure. Nobody has mentioned it yet, but there has been a little crisis since he got there, which was that some contract employees in the Urdu service, which is spoken primarily in Pakistan, some parts of India, contract employees, not full-time, full-scale employees of the Voice of America, aired on the Urdu service a profile of sorts of Vice President Biden that was sharply biased in his favor, and especially aimed at a Muslim audience, which most Urdu listeners would be, and promoting Vice President Biden. People found out about it. I think it's Politico that broke the story in the non-trade press in the major media, and that was, of course, something that should not have happened. It certainly wasn't something that Michael Pack was involved in making happen. He's been investigating it, and I don't know, there was some question whether these contractors should be fired or simply disciplined in some fashion. But it is ironic that the only known instance of abuse of the objectivity of VOA that has received a lot of attention was actually on the other side. But it's not something that Michael Pack made happen. It's something that he discovered had happened.
I don't know. So in a previous answer, you talked about how the journalists that we had seen at Voice of America, they would have very much likely been journalists in their own countries. And that kind of segues into this. The next subject I want to talk about is the US visa renewals. And what would that mean for journalists? And why should that be of a concern to the public? Because my understanding is many users that go back, there's a danger for them to go back to their home country. Is that so?
This is an important detail of the attack on the Voice of America that probably many people don't know very much about. Many of the people who work there, especially in the language services, have languages, in some cases, they're not even taught in the United States. We're not the world champions in teaching foreign languages to begin with. But Pashto and Dari, the languages of Afghanistan, for example, two of the languages of Afghanistan, it is very hard to find Native American speakers of Pashto and Dari. I remember when I was there, we had a Kurdish service. It was actually led by somebody from New York who was believed to be one of only a few dozen Native American-born people who spoke Kurdish at the time. Now, this is 20 plus years ago. So it was a natural thing that in some cases there were Peace Corps volunteers who came back and spoke obscure languages and who did go to work, at least for a time, in the Foreign Service and at VOA. But it was a standard practice to try to find people, especially people with journalistic credentials, overseas in the what we used to call target countries of the broadcast, who could help get the service out in those languages. Well, it's consistent with Trump administration policy to try not to renew the visas of people from overseas in various ways, or people. I mean, everybody working at VOA was here legally, as far as I know, but they did have special visas permitting them to work at VOA. I can't imagine a benign purpose behind trying to deny them renewal of their visas to be in the United States, unless it's to weaken the language services. Now, whatever you think the purpose of the language services might be, and the purpose of VOA might be, it's not going to help to take away from VOA people who can speak the languages where we need to broadcast. And I can only assume that this is intended to weaken the mission and the performance of VOA. And I don't know what the reason is other than a dislike for immigrants.
There's another question that's come in. Can you please tie the lack of language training in the US to your time to go share literature that required overseas study to graduate, and why foreign exposure is so important?
Oh, well, that's a home run pitch for me. For 13 years, I was president, after I actually left VOA to become president of Goucher College in Baltimore, a liberal arts college. And we were, after a certain number of years, the only college in the country that required some period of foreign study, overseas study, in order to graduate from our college. The requirement is still in place at Goucher College under my successors, but it's a little harder to make it happen right now, especially during the era of the pandemic. I mean, a vast number of students studying overseas were forced to come home in March of this year, March and April, because of the coronavirus. But I think it's essential. I think the United States is well behind other countries, particularly China, in the number of students sent overseas. And I believe that I wrote a piece about this for Foreign Affairs, which was published, I believe, in 2015, called Study Abroad Solution was its subtitle. I can't remember the title right now, but I think it's an extremely important thing, and I think that this country benefits immeasurably whenever young Americans have exposure overseas. It benefits because of the expertise and the exposure they bring home. It also benefits because the people overseas actually tend to like the young Americans who come and study there. They learn from them. They see a side of America that they might not see in wealthy tourists traveling overseas. So there are many, many benefits to the United States for that. And I think that I can't think of anything in this country, any line of endeavor, that would not be improved by more people studying abroad.
I know we're nearing towards the end of our conversation, so if there's anyone that wants to ask a question, please make sure to put that in the Q&A portion. Sanford, I would love to hear more about the Free Speech Project at Georgetown, and can you tell us more about it and what we can expect from the Free Speech Project?
Sure. Well, just briefly, knowing that we're coming to the end of our time, the Free Speech Project is a nonpartisan, mostly student-staffed organization at Georgetown. In fact, we only have 2 employees, myself and one other, who are not current students at Georgetown. And we're documenting the threat to free speech from all directions in the United States in recent years. We have something we call the Free Speech Tracker. It hit 350 entries just this week, 350 incidents of threats to free speech that we've documented. And really, we let the chips fall where they may. This is not a liberal versus conservative thing. It's really an attempt to defend free speech. We also, I would love for people to go to our website, freespeechproject.georgetown.edu. A beautiful website. And one of the things I'd like people to look at are our curriculum modules, which are intended to help advanced high school teachers and college and university teachers, professors, help their students study and learn about free speech in various different domains. We have a monthly newsletter you can sign up for. We do public programs, we're doing podcasts, and I think we are trying to do a public service by documenting the threat to First Amendment values within this country.
And you have a talk that's coming up, correct? Can you tell us more about the talk you have? I think, is it the end of this month?
August 31st. Right. We have Bart Gellman, one of America's great investigative journalists and writers about foreign policy issues. Bart Gellman, during his time at the Washington Post, was the person who first entered into negotiations with Edward Snowden for documents he was about to provide. You don't have to love Edward Snowden. You don't have to think that what he did was a wonderful thing. But thank you. Somebody has put on the chat line now the name of my piece in Foreign Policy, in Foreign Affairs, The Study Abroad Solution, How to Open the American Mind. And in fact, it was published in the March-April 2016 issue of Foreign Affairs. But I've lost my train of thought.
So the talk for the August 31st?
Oh, yeah. So Bart Gellman and I are going to engage in a conversation. It's going to be called Free Speech, Dissent, and Surveillance. He's had some absolutely terrifying experience as a journalist who exposed things that the government, whoever was in charge, didn't want him to expose. And he's going to talk about that, talk about the threat to dissent in this country, to protesters, the investigation of them in ways that is reminiscent of the era of J. Edgar Hoover. So 31st of August, we will publicize it online. And if you go to that website, that web address, there'll be full information emerging on it in the next few days.
Wonderful. We'll be sure to share it with our community in our email outlet, in our MailChimp. So one thing that we do ask all of our speakers is, what does press freedom mean to you?
Well, I grew up in a small town, very small town, where we always assumed that public officials, the police, that everybody was working in our interest. And they were our heroes, and then as I got a little bit older in high school and I saw there were some corrupt people who were stealing from the public, there were people who, the hard coal mining area of Pennsylvania where I grew up fell in hard times, and there were a lot of terrible symptoms of economic decline. And I began to see that the public interest was not always served by public officials. And so to me, press freedom, freedom of speech means the right to have accurate and truthful information, not alternative facts, not, there have been such abuses in recent years of this terminology. The truth, the real truth. And so that's what free speech means to me. That's what press freedom means. That's what the First Amendment means. The right of the people to know what's really happening around them. The right of people to achieve security, safety, knowledge of public affairs in their own country and around the world. And I think it's one of the key distinguishing factors of a democracy from other forms of government. And when we have one member of the Supreme Court who has already said he thinks the scope of the First Amendment should be re-examined, I worry a lot about what could happen to free speech in this country. So in my, I don't know, third or fourth career, whatever it is I'm in now, that's what I'm devoting myself to, is trying to clarify, edify the situation around free speech. And again, anyone who looks just beneath the surface of our website will see that we're defending free speech, not just on one part of the political spectrum, but all across it.
Wonderful. And it looks like we have a comment from Zora Hopkins. Sandy, not a question, just so happy to see that you're well and doing great things. VOA has never been the same since you left. Keep safe.
Well, Zora, it's wonderful to hear from you, and I owe you an email.
Is there anything else you'd like to add before we end the conversation?
Not me. I thank you for your hospitality, and I hope we can spread interest in VOA and the real VOA, and the real function that it can perform and has generally performed for this country. And please look at our Free Speech Project website, spread the word, and I think that you'll find some very useful tools there to to teach young people about free speech.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
That's it.
Before we say goodbye to everyone, we wanted to make our announcements for next week. Next Tuesday, we're going to be having Ghada Weiss, who is the principal anchor and presenter for Al Jazeera Arabic. She previously worked for a number of Lebanese newspapers, television channels, and radio stations, and has spent more than 2 decades in broadcast journalism. In a recent Washington Post op-ed in July, she discusses the online social media attacks against her, and we look forward to talking to her and digging deeper with her about this current state of journalism for women during the age of cyber attacks. On the 25th, towards the end of the month, our last conversation is a joint effort with the freelance community of SPJ, with Rafael Espinal of the Freelancers Union. He is the newly appointed president and executive director, and we're going to be discussing the landscape of the gig economy in America and where it's evolving, and we'll discuss the challenges and the changes taking place in the freelance industry in the US and around the world, but providing an opportunity to connect with him. We thank you all for tuning in, and thank you, Sanford, for joining us today.
Thank you, Elle, and thank you, Dan, and thanks for those who tuned in.
Thank you, and we will see everyone next week. Be safe.